All right. I'm seeing the increase in the numbers slow down. So I think we'll go ahead and start. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. This is the second installment in our post-bac career exploration series this fall. And today we have some really great panelists to talk about careers in genetic counseling. And so I'm excited to hear from them. I want to just cover a couple of housekeeping things. Thank you all for being here. You won't have the option to unmute since this is a webinar format, but you do have the option to put in questions in the Q&A. And in fact, we are going to use your questions throughout the panel. So please, yes, we're going through introductions, be thinking about the questions that you have for our panelists. Do please use the Q&A function rather than the chat. We'll be primarily looking there. And so if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you should see Q&A as an option. Please let us know if you're having any trouble. Definitely you can message me in the chat if you have questions or any issues with audio or captions or things like that. And with that, I'm really happy to welcome our panelists, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lori Erby. Lori.
Yeah, thanks very much, Laura, and thanks for inviting me to moderate this panel. I'm really excited to I think we're all really excited to share our career with you. I'm just going to say a few words about myself and then turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves to you. So I'm Lori. I'm the program director at the joint genetic counseling training program that's run between Johns Hopkins and the National Institutes of Health. I'm actually a graduate of that program from a little more than 20 years ago at this point, and have practiced myself in prenatal genetic counseling, neurogenetics, and pediatric genetics, but most of my career has been in research and genetic counseling research and teaching. Grace, Mike, and Weiyi, I'll have you introduce yourselves, maybe Grace first.
Sure. I'm excited to be here as well. Just like Lori, I'm pretty excited, especially because I actually started my genetic counseling journey as a post-bac at NIH. So I was once where you all were. So just to backtrack a little bit more, as far as my training, and it's going to go way back because I went to the same program as Lori. That she now directs, the NIH Johns Hopkins program. We were in the same class. So it's always nice to be reunited with Lori, even if it's on Zoom. And so for undergrad, I went to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I am from the Maryland area. And while I was at UMBC, which we call it for short, I was in a pipeline program for STEM for individuals who were underrepresented in STEM fields. And, that's a part of my story that I'll talk a little bit more about later, the importance of, being part of mentorship programs, if you're able to, and being part of programs like the post-bac program and all the resources they provide. So I learned about genetic counseling when I was, I think in my junior year of college, in my genetics course, I just kind of stumbled upon it. I was a biology major, not quite sure what I wanted to do with my degree, but I knew I had an interest in the life sciences and psychology. And so when I saw this kind of graphic image, this graphic representation of a woman getting an amniocentesis and a description of genetic counseling, I knew it was something I wanted to learn more about and pursue. So after I graduated, I took that bridge year and spent it as a post-bac at NIH working in a laboratory. And that was a great experience because at NIH, there at the time, and there still is obviously genetic counselors. And as I was able to sit in a GC seminar class to learn more about the profession. And I got into the genetic counseling program at NIH. It's a 2.5-year program. It's one of the longer programs. What I will say is that for me, choosing that particular program is because it was strong in research and also in psychosocial aspects of genetic counseling. And so I've graduated over 20 years ago, so I won't go through my whole career. Maybe that'll be part of, the Q&A. But I will say currently, I am back at NIH. I spent some time at community hospitals and health systems in the Washington, D.C. area. And I came back to NIH over 6 years ago to work at the National Cancer Institute. And the majority of my career has been focused on cancer genetic counseling. I'm a lead genetic counselor on a hereditary gastric cancer study, but I support several different research protocols related to all types of cancers. Some of them are studies where they're providing treatments. Some of the studies are just natural history studies where they're trying to learn more about the disease. And the individuals with certain pathogenic variants or mutations in particular cancer genes. And some of them are for individuals who are just at risk for cancer because of a hereditary factor. And so trying to screen them to catch cancer early. So just want to give you a little bit about the front end and where I am now, and I can turn it over to Weiyi, see if she wants to go next.
Sure, thanks so much, Grace-Ann. So I am a clinical genetic counselor, so which means that I spend 100% of my time seeing patients. I am currently working at Johns Hopkins University, mostly in the Department of Neurology. And so a little bit about my background and how I got to be where I am now. When I was an undergrad, I was probably like some of you may have been a biology major. I also did a double degree in music, so that was fun, but I knew I wanted to do something in biology. And I tried the research track. I worked in a lab, and I also thought about going to medical school, but due to various events, mostly because I was drawn towards the idea of counseling and having some direct interventions in the lives of people who were experiencing a crisis of some sort, I felt really drawn to this idea of genetic counseling. I observed a genetic counselor at that Columbia University Medical Center, and after a summer of working with her, I felt very compelled to apply for genetic counseling programs. I did apply right out of undergrad, but many people in genetic counseling have taken another career or done another degree, so I think my path is becoming a little less usual. And I will say just briefly in terms of advice that there are so many winding ways people can get to genetic counseling, and it almost always benefits them to have that different background to enhance your understanding of the field and what you can do in it. So, but for me, it was more of a direct path. I did go to the NIH Johns Hopkins Genetic Counseling Program. I graduated in 2013, and right out of grad school, I did apply for, there were a limited number of positions at that time. I knew I wanted to do something clinical, and so I applied for a position at Johns Hopkins and have been there ever since. So my path is a little more boring. So I have been working here for the past 10 years, but over the course of my work here, I have become more specialized in neurogenetics. My work involves seeing patients, counseling patients, following up on patients who are usually referred for either a personal history of neurological disease or a family history of neurogenetic disease. So this includes working in the Huntington's clinic, the ALS clinic, the ataxia clinic. I also see patients who have seizures, who have brain malformations, a host of variety of different neurological conditions. And I'm happy to answer more questions about my work as we continue our conversation.
Lori, it's such a pleasure for me to be on a panel with Grace, Lori, and Weiyi. I can't believe I'm actually presenting and talking about my journey alongside them, based on their careers so far. And I actually just met Grace today, but I have both Lori and Weiyi to thank for getting me to where I am today, and I'm excited to include that as part of my story. So I actually have one of the more atypical journeys that Weiyi referred to. So I graduated with a degree in psychology and history from SUNY Stony Brook on Long Island. And I initially wanted to do clinical psych, and I got a little disheartened with going into that field. Exactly, I took biopsych and loved it, and I just didn't know what to do with that. And so I figured rather than just jump straight into grad school, I'll spend at least the first part of my 20s, doing a stereotypical like finding myself journey of discovery. So I did a few years with AmeriCorps, National Civilian Community Corps, and got to tour the country and work with different nonprofits. I then found myself in Washington, D.C., working at different associations and nonprofits there. And ultimately, I realized, I'm just sitting in front of a computer 9 to 5 in a cubicle doing administrative work. And this isn't what I had envisioned for my life or my career. And there's parts of it that I really loved, but I always felt like I wanted to reconnect with the psychology. And so I started taking classes at night at UDC Community College just to start to get the science courses under my belt that I avoided the first time around through undergrad, thinking maybe I'll do nursing. And then still pretty unsure about my path. And then my mom actually found an article in, I think, like Times Magazine or something about genetic counseling. It was the first time I'd ever heard of it. And at first I was like, okay, Mom, stop, I'll figure out what I need to do on my own. But I actually read it and I was like, holy cow, shoot, this is perfect. Thank you, Mom. And so then I switched gears and I took all the rest of the prerequisites I needed to apply to genetic counseling programs. And I just tried to check off all the boxes along the way. And that's when I first crossed paths with Lori, who really connected me with multiple alumni that created shadowing opportunities. And then they introduced me to their friends. And I was able to apply to school with just a shadowing of mentors and just a really beautiful amount of practical experience under my belt just to get into a program. And so I very fortunately wound up at a University of Maryland, Baltimore genetic counseling training program. And part of why I applied there was it's part of their School of Medicine. And so you really get the best of both worlds with all different types of clinic right there in-house at the hospital, but they also have a lot of great opportunities in partnership with Johns Hopkins as well as other hospitals in the area. And the professors at that school often are from, they're experts in whatever field they're teaching that particular topic on. So when you're learning about cardiology or the genetics of cardiology, you're getting a cardiogeneticist or just a cardiologist coming in and talking about it. So it's really beautiful to learn from all these great minds throughout that journey. And then, of course, we have shadowing opportunities or rotations. And then, of course, as a student, you perform the counseling alongside a supervisor. And one of my very first shadowing opportunities as a student was with Weiyi at the ataxia clinic at Johns Hopkins. And it was so intense. I have so much respect for the work done in that clinic. I remember afterwards having a conversation just about like how to handle the emotional baggage of difficult conversations. And even just as a student, I was holding back tears listening from these sessions. And it really was a formative point in my training to understand the impact we can have both clinically and in a practical sense, but also emotionally and in adapting to disease and what a vital part we play in people's journey there. So I hope I'm not talking for too long, but ultimately I found myself at NIH with the group at NIAID, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And I work there, of course, as a genetic counselor. My time is pretty evenly split between, actually, now it's more so operations focused. So I'm actually using a lot of the skills I had in the office administrative jobs in my 20s and all those nice tips and tricks I learned along the way to make sure our program runs smoothly. And then I'm about 20% clinical counseling, working with patients and families. What our protocol does is, even though we're housed within NIAID, we've now spread to, I think, 4 or 5 different institutes throughout the NIH, working with dozens of different study teams. And we can send patients and their families to whole genome sequencing primarily to help their referring teams either come up with a diagnosis and figure out a treatment plan for them, or sometimes more primarily to help their research interests so that we can better be able to diagnose families in the future, understand the modifiers that play a role in disease. And so my job is to consent families onto the protocol to make sure that they're making an informed choice, to make sure that participating and receiving this type of information is right for them. And then on the back end, we write reports based on our geneticist's analysis of the findings, and then we disclose the information back to families. So that's my job and career path in a nutshell.
Thanks, everybody. And I think that gives us a really nice overview of sort of the different kinds of things that you each do in your jobs. And what we'd like to do now is open the floor to questions. So I know that there are a number of you here, and with lots of different experiences. So please use the Q&A to ask whatever you'd like to know about this career. And while we wait for the questions to roll in, I guess I'll start with one, which is just thinking about the fact that I'm sure that many of our attendees are thinking about transitioning to genetic counseling from bench research. Can you each talk, you've talked on it a little bit, but think a little bit more out loud about what skills you would need as a genetic counselor to be a strong applicant, as somebody who's sort of making that transition. So what are things that these attendees should be thinking about?
I can start. Because I think what's important is thinking through, what are your passions and what are you most interested in doing in your career, and whether, you have that desire to interact with patients. And like Weiyi was saying, working with people, oftentimes they're in a crisis situation, dealing with, a child who may have a genetic diagnosis, or in the cancer setting, someone who has been diagnosed with cancer or is at risk for cancer, or a neurological condition. So you really are dealing with people in a time in their lives where they need a lot of support and patience and empathy. So, it's really thinking through, your desires to be in that type of helping profession. Mike talked about how emotional it can be, just when he was observing a genetic counseling session. And so as a genetic counselor in the clinical setting, you are, working with patients on a daily basis, dealing with those tough situations that patients are in, and being there with them, and providing education. So that's sort of like the first step is, being able to have exposure to the genetic counseling field to really make sure that's something that you're interested in. Attending this type of event is wonderful. And I worked in a laboratory setting before I transitioned into a genetic counseling program. And I know things are completely different now with the application process, but I think it's really important to think through what skills you're learning in the laboratory that will help and be useful as a genetic counselor. Again, how Mike was saying, some of those operational skills that he learned, he's now using them. So genetic counselors do such broad types of work now beyond just the clinical setting. So I think it's just important to really think through what type of skills and strengths are you obtaining working in the lab? Are you working in a setting where you are learning more about, different types of genes and how they function in humans or in other animals? Like, what exactly are you doing that is like increasing your knowledge base regarding genetics? And then just reaching out to genetic counselors and networking is important too. Like Mike was saying, how he met Lori and she kind of introduced him to her network of genetic counselors. I think that's really important too, as a way to learn more about the field and the profession.
Just add to what Grace shared in terms of how important it is to emphasize the science communication aspect. As people who are working in labs, even if you're involved in direct basic research, you are involved in communicating science, right? Sharing your ideas with other scientists, with the public, and that's a very fundamental part of genetic counseling, this thoughtful, personalized, and compassionate communication. And even if you're not working in a clinical genetic counseling field, you're advocating for your research participant, you're advocating for people with genetic conditions, you're always thinking about ways to make information clear and relevant. In your personal statements, if you're applying to genetic counseling programs, that's really a place for you to share your journey and how your experiences have shaped your desires to contribute And I think it's especially interesting to hear people's stories of how they see themselves helping in these professions, not just why you like the field, but how you see yourself contributing, how you want to help, and um, why you want to help in this particular way. There's so many different ways to love science and help people, but in what ways? Is it creating knowledge? Is it making it accessible? Is it making it relevant? All of those things would be helpful to mention.
Excellent points made so far. I guess to round out the advice here, I can't stress enough the importance of getting the skills in your tool belt to really learn how to connect with patients in a psychosocial sense, understand what their motivations and expectations are for testing, learn how to properly listen. And so a good way to demonstrate that is prior experience, either volunteering for a crisis hotline, whether that's text or phone calls. So when I was an undergraduate student, I worked for a few years at a crisis hotline for suicide prevention. And the skills I learned there, even though, a lot of people aren't necessarily in that extreme of a crisis situation, just learning how to reflect and to listen and have those basic counseling skills prior to applying. And then also just showing that, you have the emotional wherewithal or the emotional intelligence, or you're at a place in your life where you're able to have these types of difficult conversations and creating skills on how to, be there for your patients, but also not allow yourself to get too emotionally invested or burnt out, and finding the right coping skills and mechanisms for you. I think that's vital as part of your application. In addition to that, I think just doing as much as you can to find shadowing opportunities and informational interviews, anything that really makes it clear that this is a career that you're specifically interested in. There's always many candidates who are extremely highly qualified, brilliant individuals, but they see genetic counseling kind of like as a plan B for medical school. And I'm sure people who have been more involved in the application process can attest to this more than myself, but I feel like those candidates are less, I guess programs are less likely to want to invite those people into their program, just because this may not be actually what their passion is, because it's a difficult job that your heart really needs to be in it. And this is what you really need to want to do with your life and your career. It's a calling, and just settling into it as a plan B, I think is a really poor mistake.
Thanks all. There are a lot of really great questions rolling into the Q&A, so I'm going to try to get through all of them. I'd like to start with, I'm going to combine a couple questions, thinking about what role genetic counselors play in the healthcare team of a single patient. So if you sort of talk about what a patient's journey looks like, where you fit into that patient's journey, and whether you collaborate with other physicians, what that collaboration looks like. And Mike, you had talked a little bit about your administrative work. So if you could each also sort of talk about the administrative roles of the genetic counselor and how that all plays in, like how much administration, how much role with the patient, what does that look like? How do you fit into the team?
Happy to start as a clinical counselor. I get referrals from all over, sometimes from neurology, sometimes from primary care providers, sometimes from the patients themselves. People can look me up on NSGC and then contact me if they're interested in an appointment. And we are always, every professional, but of course we're talking about genetic counselors, we all work as part of a team. You are never really in a field alone. I don't think I really quite understood that when I was in undergrad or as a postbac. I thought you really were a one-person show and you had to be really smart and understand everything. And it really is that in any field of expertise, you understand what your role is, what your area of expertise and your best practice is, and then you communicate that with others. So in a given week, I spend about maybe 2 or 3 days seeing patients. Sometimes it's just a few patients, 2 or 3. Sometimes, like Mike remembers, in some of the more intense clinics, up to 8 patients back to back in a day, usually for an hour each. And every time I'm seeing a patient, I'm usually preparing for that patient beforehand and communicating sometimes with the referring provider. So for example, neurologists, my neurology colleagues referred a patient to see me at 1 o'clock. And for that patient, I'm looking through the neurologist's notes. And if I have any questions, what thoughts did you have on which genetic condition you think I should be helping to evaluate for? I might send them a message or run down the hall and ask them some questions. And then after the testing is done, we always communicate back to the neurologists that are referring to us of what the results showed and come up with a plan. And in some really nice collaborations, when it makes sense to, we have a joint visit with neurology to disclose the results when we get a diagnosis and it is treatable. There are medications implications for the patient and the family. We organize joint visits so that the family has all of the providers that they need to be able to answer their questions. I'm going to be able to answer information about the diagnosis, the genetics, and deal with the psychosocial implications of what does this mean for me, but neurology is going to be able to answer treatment, what medications, what's my plan for monitoring, and it is wonderful to be able to take care of those concerns as a team. In terms of administrative work, I do spend a lot of time filling out paperwork, filling out writing letters, writing notes for patients. There's an interesting time study done in Israel actually about 5-6 years ago about how many hours it takes to see a genetics patient. And that study said, and I think that's pretty accurate for what I do, every 1 hour face-to-face, you have about 6 to 7 hours in the back end. So that means hours of looking at the patient's note. I don't remember all of the different thousands of genes that are available for testing. So when there's a new gene, I learn about that, look up papers. That's sort of the fun part of the job too. You are able to always constantly learn and you're always reading papers about what's the latest for this condition or that condition. Look up the patient's insurance, fill out any sort of pre-charting that you need to do, communicate, like I said, with the referring providers, and then after the visit, you spend time writing the note, you call insurance, you fill out paperwork, you send out the testing, you package up the blood sample or the saliva sample, you run it down to FedEx, and you coordinate results, deal with when the sample's missing, and the follow-up questions about family testing. So all of that, of course, takes a lot of administrative time.
Others want to weigh in on that. Thank you, Weiyi.
Yeah, I think I can add a little to what Weiyi was saying, even though a lot of what she was saying overlaps with how I function. So definitely teamwork is the name of the game in what I do here at NCI. And as most of you know, anyone who comes to the National Institutes of Health, including NCI, are enrolled on a research protocol. And so research is a big part of what I do. And so the way I work with teams, it differs depending on which particular study the patient is enrolled on. For some of the studies where the focus is on a specific hereditary cancer condition, like the hereditary gastric cancer study that I'm the lead genetic counselor on, I really am involved in the day-to-day care and aspect of getting the patient enrolled on the study. So for instance, once patients are referred to us or they self-refer, then I need to review their genetic test report to make sure it was done in a clinical diagnostic laboratory, make sure that their variant or mutation does actually fit with what we're looking for in the study and making sure that they're eligible. It also involves attending the study team's weekly meetings to provide education, or if there's ever any questions about additional testing for the patient or strategies to offer testing for their relatives, which we call cascade testing when there's already a mutation identified in the family. So with the hereditary gastric cancer team and with those type of hereditary studies, I'm really embedded in the study and also providing education to the treatment teams about genetics. And they also provide me with a lot of education as well. The team involves a dietitian because many of the patients do choose to remove their stomachs to reduce their risk, and that could have long-term consequences on their nutrition and dietary needs. So the dietitian is a key member. The head of the study is a surgical oncologist, so he performs the surgeries. We have research nurses involved in our study, and gastroenterologist. And so with that team, again, I'm really kind of like an integral member of that particular team because the focus is on hereditary cancer. And so that means I'm also really involved on the data analysis and dissemination of results end of things too, which is somewhat administrative. It's not really talking to the patients and doing things clinically, which of course I do perform that. A lot of it's done virtually now because of COVID. We went virtual and kind of haven't gone back to in-person yet, at least, the team of genetic counselors that I'm on at NIH. And so it's not just about seeing the patients, but I have to carve out time to make sure, especially with the family history data, which is a big part of this gastric study, but several other studies. I help to manage a lot of the family history data. And then also when manuscripts are prepared, helping to review them, and then also doing presentations to medical communities that are interested in this particular condition, and also presentations to genetic counselors as well. So, in a research setting, there is a lot that goes into, taking care of the patient, but then also, looking at the information that we're gathering in aggregate and being able to summarize that information and write it up and put it out and publish so that the knowledge can be shared with other members of the medical community. And there's a big piece of like emailing and writing and reading and doing lit searches that are involved in that. I try to carve out 1 or 2 days to see patients, but my week really can be kind of unpredictable depending on the patient's schedule and when they're available. But it's pretty much each day is a little bit different and interesting for sure.
Thanks, Gracie. And I think you actually, in addition to answering the question I asked, helped foreshadow the next question I was going to ask, which is somebody in the Q&A had asked about the roles of genetic counselors and research teams, which I think both you and Mike can speak to because you do that on a daily basis. And I think you addressed a lot of that already. There was one sort of second part of that question that I'd like to ask you to think a little bit about, and I'm also happy to weigh in. The questioner was asking whether genetic counselors can serve as PIs on a grant and whether they're typically involved in publications, and sort of talk about sort of your role in the research team in terms of leading research efforts or being integral.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll just say yes. Genetic counselors can serve as principal investigators. So, the person who takes the lead and, having the vision of the research study and developing the research protocol, kind of outlining, the types of patients that are going to be enrolled, and also developing the informed consent so patients have a good understanding of the risks, benefits, and limitations of the study. And Lori can talk a lot about this because she's led a lot of studies. And so at NIH, because we work at NIH, we're on the intramural side of things. And so we don't really have to apply for grants, which may be different if you're in like an academic university setting. Typically there are some internal grant and ways to do research without applying for grants, but in the academic setting, typically you would have to apply for a grant from someone like NIH, and that's our extramural program. And definitely genetic counselors are involved in writing grants. There are genetic counselors who go on to get PhDs, and Lori, you can talk about that because Lori has her PhD, because they know they really do want to take the lead on research protocols. In my role, there's some small studies that I have taken the lead on, but I'm mainly working in like a supporting role in research, and like dip my toe here and there in possibly leading some bigger projects. That's something I'm thinking about now. But everybody's career has a different trajectory when it comes to research, depending on what your goals are and what you're most interested in. But I want to punt it back to you, Lori, to talk about your research experience?
Yeah, I'm happy to weigh in on this question in particular. And as our program, as Grace Ann said, I do a lot of research in genetic counseling and did choose to get my PhD because I asked that question of myself, do I want to get to spend a lot of my career asking my own questions, or do I want to serve on a team? And I like both. And I had a lot of questions myself. So thought, gosh, I might need the PhD if I'm going to want to ask the questions I want to get to direct and ask. And the PhD is incredibly helpful for that. But it's not necessarily essential. I do have some colleagues who've been able to have pretty strong research careers asking their own questions without getting the PhD. And it's highly dependent on your institution and your institutional support. So at NIH, that is very possible because, as Grace Ann said, we don't have to write grants, and it's just a matter of having a supportive team that you're working in who says, yes, that your vision for a question is something that fits within our team's vision. Go ahead, propose that to the IRB and ask your question. If you're going to be writing grants, if you're outside of the NIH and you need to fund research, there are a lot of smaller funders that you don't have to have a PhD to be the PI on a grant for. So a lot of nonprofits will provide funding for the kinds of research that we do. Many NIH grants do require you to have a PhD, and many institutions, medical institutions, will require their faculty to have a PhD in order to write a grant. So it may be institution specific more than funder specific. So it's an important question to ask when you're getting a job, whether genetic counselors in your institution who don't have a PhD would be allowed to write grants and serve as PI on the grant. But there is a movement towards more flexibility, and the NIH, so NHGRI took the lead a couple of years ago by offering an RFA that encouraged genetic counselors without PhDs to be the PI on research related to genetic counseling. And so there is definitely a movement toward more of that, but I won't pretend there's no barriers. So I want to think about another question that was asked was more about applications. And I know several of you have mentioned the idea of shadowing prior to getting into school. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the legal limitations to shadowing, or whether, or advice for applicants trying to find shadowing opportunities. What advice is there for finding resources to shadow?
Yeah, so there, as a clinical genetic counselor, I get contacts all the time from students, trainees interested in applying and wanting shadowing experiences. Unfortunately, our institution and many institutions have limited shadowing virtually because of privacy concerns. You don't know who's taking screen captures and recording on the other side of the screen. And so that has been a big limitation. Our volunteer office has been trying to work on that. In the meantime, though, I do think there is a high burden on clinical counselors to try to coordinate these shadowing experiences. It is very important, but it is not the only way to get exposures and experiences in genetic counseling. In fact, there are actually many videos online of genetic counseling interviews, genetic counseling sessions, mock sessions, or even, so there are news clips of patients with Huntington's disease going through the entire testing process that gives you wonderful insight into what it's like for a genetic counseling session in that setting. I think using those resources, I think there's a great genetic counseling Discord channel that there are lists of experiences, and trying to think of other ways to understand what it's like to be in a patient-facing session, or what it's like to be a genetic counselor. I find that I've had students who haven't had as much, don't get as much out of the shadowing experience because they also don't know what to look for. So I think it's not so much about getting the number of shadowing experiences, but being able to understand what you're looking for, what you're observing, and that might be how the genetic counselor is interacting, what specific statements a genetic counselor is saying that will be helpful, and most importantly, whether you can envision yourself in that field. And the more depth that you can achieve from that, whether that's actually just reading a book. For example, there's a great book called Inside the O'Briens, which features a genetic counselor as a character, which has a very accurate description of what it's like to go through a Huntington's testing experience. The more you can speak to that directly, even if there's limited shadowing experiences, I think that will be helpful to you. And you're not alone in limited shadowing experiences. Everybody is having that difficulty.
Yeah, I think what you said it pretty astutely just that, I think programs are pretty aware that shadowing opportunities are few and far between. And in fact, many programs are trying to get opportunities for their current genetic counseling students to work with GCs. And I think it's just the nature of a rapidly expanding field where there's, more interest and applicants into programs than there are jobs available, which is good news for graduates where it's not too difficult to find a placement, but it is hard for a large number of students interested in applying to programs to find these types of experiences. But I do think that even having informational interviews, even if you're not in the clinic setting with genetic counselors, to talk with them about their experiences and what they enjoy from the career and what some of the challenges are, and just what you guys are doing now, listening to these types of panels, and then internalizing what some of the lessons are from this, and then incorporating that into, let's say, an essay or an application saying, I listened to Mike Kamen during this talk about XYZ, and I learned this about the field. I feel like that's a pretty appropriate substitute as if you're not able to find as much in-person shadowing opportunities, because they really are challenging to come by. It took quite some time until I was able to find something. Within the NIH, I've had, not that I want to open up the floodgates here, but a few ERDAs that all work directly through our team, as well as ERDAs on teams that refer to us have shadowed our consents and some of our disclosures. So if your team happens to work with us and that you're going to see one of your patients, I'm sure I could speak for my other genetic counselors on this team and myself that we'd be happy to have you shadow a session, but it's not easy to accommodate every request.
I just wanted to add a couple more things because Weiyi and Mike covered everything for the most part, but Mike made me think about how post-bacs you are in a position where you're already part of NIH and you've done the HIPAA training and things like that. So you're in an institution, most of you, I know some of you may not be post-bacs who are on the call, but you're in a position where if you reach out to the genetic counselors at NIH, and you can find a lot of us on the Find a Genetic Counselor feature on nsgc.org. You may not get responses from everyone because people are busy, but it doesn't hurt to reach out and see if there's opportunities to shadow. Going back to the question about going from bench science to genetic counseling exposure, I told you I was a post-bac. In the last 3 years, I've had 3 different post-bacs on our specific genetic counseling team, and I've directly mentored a couple of them. And a couple of them actually did do 1 year as a post-bac in the lab, and then realized that they wanted to get more genetic counseling exposure and did their own networking and reached out to genetic counselors at NIH and were able to be placed with us for their 2nd year of their post-bac experience. So that's something else that can be considered if you're serious about genetic counseling. You found out about it kind of late in your 1st year of your post-bac, is to consider it. It's not easy. The 2 post-bacs that we had, they really had to reach out to a lot of people before they were able to, match up with our team. But that's also another possibility, is to reach out to genetic counselors. Because a lot of times when you're reaching out and trying to find a post-bac position, they give you the list of the PIs and the different laboratories that are accepting post-bacs. But you may want to reach out to genetic counselors because I think most genetic counselors at NIH now have experiences with bringing you on a post-bac. So that's something you may want to consider.
We've been talking a bit about preparing for your application, and I think we've been focusing on shadowing, but there is a questioner who is asking for additional tips, other tips that we might have for people who are about to start the application process, particularly for this upcoming cycle, which is coming up soon. And in particular, thinking about how financial considerations and how to make it more affordable. So I'm also happy to weigh in on this one, but I'd like your thoughts as well.
I think I might have been a pretty annoying applicant. I emailed every program director that I was applying to the program, asked to meet with them prior to the application, asked if I can talk with alumni, asked if I could do a tour of the school, just anything I could to like learn more, to get my name out there, and to try to get as much information as possible. I know that there's so many applicants, and often that's perhaps not always the best approach, but I think that just not being shy and asking for what you're looking for, connecting with alumni is a helpful step in the process.
I mean, I think that Weiyi, she mentioned the Discord for prospective genetic counseling students, and it does have a lot of resources and information about whether or not programs offer tuition remission or stipends. So really, doing your research as far as the financial side of it, because it can get pretty costly. There are some diversity scholarships as well for individuals who are from backgrounds who are underrepresented in the field. And I know there's a big scholarship program that has 2 students per year at Sarah Lawrence College, Boston University, Rutgers, I believe, and University of Maryland. And University of Pennsylvania is the one who's housing it. I know that the NIH program does offer some remission and stipend as well. So, you don't want to limit yourself to just those programs, but it is good to know which programs offer some type of financial assistance for sure. And as far as other application advice, I think, everything that was shared about gaining shadowing experiences. Also, social media is another way to find different opportunities. I will say my last post back, I met her on Twitter, which I never thought I would say anything like that. But that's how we ended up connecting. I wasn't a big social media person, but I happened to get on Twitter because I was told the genetic counseling community, there were some active genetic counselors who posted pretty often. There's an initiative called the Genetic Counseling Experience Initiative, and it's a group of prospective genetic counseling students who invite genetic counselors to put on case conferences to get, not case conferences, to present cases so that prospective genetic counselors can get some insights into the workup and the risk assessment and the process of thinking through testing options and reporting results and some of the ethical issues and psychosocial issues surrounding the case. So you may want to consider joining Twitter because you can make connections that way as well. And the hashtag to follow would be hashtag GeneChat. And then you would be linked into the conversations that are concerning genetic counseling.
Great advice. And I have very little to add to that because you guys have already shared, I think, most of what there is. I'll reiterate, Grace-Ann, you were mentioning that our program does offer, since we're here at the NIH, I should talk a little bit about what our offer. So our students do all come in as pre-doc ERDAs. So you're all familiar with what the ERDA process looks like. You end up with a stipend in our program. So, and there is a tuition, there's a 30% tuition discount and a scholarship in your first year. So we have put together a package to try to make it more affordable. And I would say most programs are being very thoughtful about trying to find ways where they can to reduce costs as much as possible, because this is something that's on all of our minds. We recognize it's really expensive. In light of that, we also have all learned during COVID that it is totally possible to do admissions processes virtually, which reduces the cost quite a lot. So most programs are sticking to remote interviews, and I suspect that'll be true in perpetuity, because that is a great way to reduce costs for interviewees who, as some of you have mentioned, are applying to multiple programs, and that can get quite costly. And then I would ask, as you're applying, whether there are waiver processes in terms of application fee waivers. I know in Maryland, there is a process to apply for application fee waivers if you're applying to either our program or the program at the University of Maryland, and other states may have similar programs. So ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. We only have 5 minutes left, and there's so many questions in our Q&A. We'll do our best to answer. I have one last one I'm going to bring to the front, and then some of the more practical questions some of you have asked, I may try to answer via email later, just so you've got them. The last question I'll ask is, what are some of the most pressing issues that the field of genetic counseling is currently facing at the moment? It's a big one.
I can take a stab at this also because I do need to leave in a few minutes. So I think there's such a great question, and this is definitely something that applicants can look for answers to in other forums as things for you to think about in your interviews as you're preparing for genetic counseling programs. But I think for me, there's a couple of things that stand out as a clinical genetic counselor. Access to genetic counseling services and equity of access of services is huge. We see so many patients that are self-referred, that are referred because they have connections, or but there are many people that we should be seeing for genetic counseling but don't have insurance or accessibility. Sometimes they're undocumented, and that prevents them from having medical visits. Sometimes it's a matter of living in, for example, a rural area and not having providers who know to refer to genetic counseling services and genetic services. So there's definitely a wide disparities, and we could talk at length about this, but that is one big issue, and it extends to hospital systems, insurance payment, racial justice, socioeconomic justice. There are so many things to talk about, but it affects healthcare in general, and genetic counseling is no exception.
Yeah, Weiyi took my answer, and she said it beautifully. So I just want to second everything that Weiyi said. The other thing I was thinking is just how we need more providers who are familiar with genetics, so that there's more individuals who can provide accurate information to patients and to serve patients from, diverse walks of life. And that requires having genetic counselors from diverse backgrounds. And so there's a workforce issue too. So there's access on the patient side, but there's also, a workforce diversity issue with genetics. And so that's another pressing issue, is trying to increase the diversity of the genetic counseling profession and just other professions that serve patients in the genomics realm and in the scientific genomics workforce as well. We just need more diverse people from different backgrounds to give us ideas so that we can move forward this equity issue. So it's a big concern, as well as the diversity of the workforce.
Just to say quickly, that's the same issue that came to mind as well. It's probably one of the biggest hot topic issues at a National Society of Genetic Counselors is just the lack of diversity, both within our workforce and the patients that have access to our clinics. And even so, just huge backlogs in certain clinics of patients wanting to see a genetic counselor, that they have to wait 6, 8, sometimes even a year for an appointment. And so there's just a total lack of access to our services.
And the only thing I would add to that, because I think these are all right answers and sort of along the same lines, is thinking about, we also need creative systems thinking, and how we help get the best services to the best people as needed, given that genetics and genomic services are likely to touch every patient at some point in their lives in the very near future. Clearly, growing the workforce isn't going to be the only solution. So needing to think about, how do we triage patients to the right level of service? Does it need to be, can a particular person with a particular risk adequately get services from their primary care provider who knows enough about genetics, or when do you need to be referred to a genetic counselor's services, somebody who can sit down with you for an hour and spend some time getting to know what your specific concerns are and helping you begin to incorporate that information psychologically into your care. So we need models to help us think about who needs to see a genetic counselor and when. I see Laura came, so I guess it's time for us to wrap up.
Thank you all so much. This hour always goes so quickly. I really want to thank all of our panelists for your insights and your time and sharing so much information with the attendees. Attendees, thank you for being here. And also, I'll just quickly say that this is recorded. If you want to refer back to it, you can use the same link and see it on Zoom. It'll be on our YouTube page later. Also, our next session in this series will be on November 4th at 1 p.m. And that one is going to be about master's degrees and, thinking about if a master's degree is the right choice for you and how that can look and how to navigate that. So just a quick plug there. Thank you all so much for your time and for being here this afternoon. And I hope that everyone enjoys the rest of your day.